The heavy barrel of a suppressed Glock pressed firmly against the nape of Marco's neck, the cold steel a sharp contrast to the humid air of the walk-in freezer. Steam from his own panicked breath frosted the crates of imported tomatoes he was huddled behind. Above him, the man holding the weapon didn't tremble. He stood as still as a mountain in a tailored charcoal suit. This was the most feared man in the tri-state area, the head of the Moretti syndicate, and he had just found his personal chef cowering among the frozen beef carcasses. A drop of sweat rolled down Marco's temple, carving a path through the flour dusting his skin, as the click of the safety disengaging echoed like a thunderclap in the small, insulated room. The journey to this freezer floor didn't begin with a bullet, but with a bowl of salt. For 3 years, the kitchen had been a sanctuary, a place where sharp knives and roaring flames made sense of a world that was otherwise jagged and loud. But today the sanctuary had become a slaughterhouse. To understand why a man who once earned a Michelin star was now staring at the tread of a mafia boss's Italian leather loafers, one must look at the red ledger currently bleeding ink into the sink of the main kitchen. This is a journey through the underbelly of a family that breaks bones as easily as eggshells, and the one man who thought he could feed the beast without being swallowed by it. Marco shifted his weight, his knees popping against the concrete floor. He didn't look up, instead focusing on the white apron tied around his waist, now stained with a splash of dark, viscous liquid that wasn't tomato sauce. "I didn't see anything, Mr. Moretti," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. The gun didn't move. Silas Moretti reached out with his free hand, his knuckles scarred from a lifetime of enforcing silence, and grabbed the collar of Marco's chef's coat. He hauled the smaller man to his feet with a single violent jerk. The air in the freezer smelled of ozone and raw iron. "The kitchen is your kingdom, Marco," Silas said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to rattle the metal shelves. "In your kingdom nothing happens without the king knowing. You knew the delivery today wasn't just Maine lobster." He shoved Marco back against the freezer door, the handle digging into his spine. Silas leaned in, the scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder radiating off him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, crushed sprig of rosemary, the signature garnish Marco placed on every plate. It was soaked in blood. The weight of the situation crashed down when Silas dropped the rosemary onto the floor and crushed it under his heel. Marco's mission had been simple: keep the boss fed, keep the staff quiet, and never, under any circumstances, look inside the silver briefcases that arrived with the morning produce. But the briefcase this morning had fallen, and the contents had spilled across the prep station. It wasn't money. It was a collection of high-definition photographs, Silas's young daughter at the park, at school, through the window of her bedroom. Someone was hunting the hunter, and the photos were covered in the same rosemary oil Marco used for his herb-crusted lamb. "Check the pantry," Silas commanded, finally lowering the gun but keeping it aimed at Marco's feet. He grabbed a heavy kitchen knife from the magnetic strip on the wall and pressed the flat of the blade against Marco's cheek. "If you think your past as a runaway in Naples stays buried because you make a good risotto, you're mistaken. You open the box. Now you taste what's inside." He pushed Marco toward the door, the cold air of the freezer replaced by the suffocating heat of the professional kitchen, where the pilot lights hissed like a pit of vipers. Silas pushed Marco into the center of the kitchen, the stainless steel surfaces reflecting the flickering overhead lights. On the butcher block sat a plate of untouched sea bass, the steam long since gone. Silas gestured to the plate with the muzzle of his gun. "Eat it," he demanded. Marco stared at the fish. He had prepared it himself, but as he looked at the delicate white flakes, he saw the slight, crystalline shimmer of something that wasn't sea salt. His hands shook as he reached for a fork, the silver clinking against the china like a funeral bell. He knew the kitchen staff had been replaced an hour ago by men who didn't know how to hold a whisk, but knew exactly how to dose a meal. "My own men," Silas whispered, pacing the line of stoves. "One of them put the rosemary in the blood. One of them put the powder in the fish. And you, Marco, you were supposed to be the one to serve it to me." He stopped pacing and turned, his eyes like polished obsidian. "Who contacted you? Who told you the girl was the price of your silence?" Marco dropped the fork. It clattered to the floor, leaving a streak of oil on the tile. He couldn't speak. The air felt like it was thickening, turning into lead in his throat. He remembered the phone call from 3 nights ago, a voice like gravel and ice telling him that the debts of his father in Naples were transferred to him. They didn't want money. They wanted a seat at the table. Literally. If you think a man like Marco, who spent his life creating beauty in a world of rot, deserves to find a way out of this kitchen alive, hit the like button so his story reaches the people who need to hear it. Marco backed away until his heels hit the grease trap. They have my sister, Silas, he blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. They sent a piece of her hair in the flour sack. Silas froze. The rage in his face didn't soften. It sharpened, becoming something colder and more calculating. He walked over to the flour sack sitting on the counter and plunged his hand into the white powder. He pulled out a small, clear plastic bag containing a single braided lock of dark hair. Silas looked at the hair, then at Marco, and for the first time he tucked the gun into his waistband. The hair is still attached to a clip, Silas noted, holding it up to the light. A school clip. My daughter has the same one. The realization hung in the air, a bridge of shared agony between the predator and the cook. Silas stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Marco whole. They aren't just using you to get to me. They're using our families to make us turn on each other. Who is the man in Naples? Marco swallowed hard, his throat dry. He goes by the Vulture. He said he's coming for the crown, and he's using my kitchen to build the throne. A sudden crash from the dining room shattered the silence. The swinging doors to the kitchen groaned on their hinges. Silas grabbed Marco by the shoulder and ducked behind the marble-topped island just as a burst of automatic fire shredded the hanging copper pots. Shards of metal and sparks rained down on them. Can you hold a gun as well as a knife, Marco? Silas hissed, checking the magazine of his Glock. Marco looked at the heavy cleaver resting on the shelf beneath them. He didn't answer with words. He gripped the wooden handle until his knuckles turned white. The kitchen erupted into a symphony of destruction. Silas popped up from behind the marble island, returning fire with surgical precision. Each shot from his suppressed weapon was a dull thwip followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor on the other side of the swinging doors. Marco stayed low, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The smell of cordite and scorched garlic filled the air. He watched as a shadow moved across the frosted glass of the side entrance, the delivery door. The Vulture's men are in the alley. Marco shouted over the roar of a stray bullet hitting a pressurized steamer. The machine whistled, a jet of scalding vapor creating a white curtain between them and the attackers. Silas glanced at the back door, then back at the front. They were pinned. The service elevator, Silas commanded, pointing toward the heavy steel doors near the dish pit. It leads to the garage. If we can get to the SUV, we have a chance to get to the safe house where my daughter is supposed to be. Marco scrambled toward the elevator, his chef's clogs slipping on a patch of spilled olive oil. He reached the buttons and mashed the down arrow, the mechanical groan of the cables sounding agonies away. A man in a dark tactical vest burst through the vapor curtain, his rifle raised. Before the attacker could pull the trigger, Marco swung the heavy meat cleaver with a primal scream. The blade buried itself in the man's forearm, the rifle clattering to the ground. Silas finished the job with a single shot to the man's chest. Move! Silas roared, shoving Marco into the elevator just as the doors began to slide shut. A hail of bullets sparked against the steel, one of them grazing Silas's shoulder. He didn't flinch, but his suit jacket began to darken with a wet, crimson stain. The elevator descended slowly, the silence inside the car even more terrifying than the noise outside. Silas leaned against the wood-paneled wall, his breathing steady but shallow. He looked at Marco, who was still clutching the blood-stained cleaver. "You're not a cook anymore, Marco," Silas said, pulling a spare magazine from his inner pocket and handing it to the chef. "You're a soldier. And if we make it to that safe house, I need you to be ready to do things that will make you forget what it's like to create anything but a grave." The elevator hit the garage level with a soft ding. The doors opened to a concrete tomb, and standing in the center of the bay, leaning against Silas's armored SUV, was a man holding a phone. He was filming. "The Vulture," Marco whispered, recognizing the gaunt, sallow face from the grainy photos his father had hidden in Italy. The man didn't have a gun. He had a remote. He held it up, a small red light blinking rhythmically. "One press, Silas," the man said, his voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "And the safe house where your daughter and this boy's sister are being held becomes a memory. Or you can put the gun down and step into the back of the van." The standoff in the garage was a vacuum of sound. Silas held the Glock steady, his finger a hair's breadth from the trigger. Marco stood to his side, the cleaver trembling in his hand. The Vulture smiled, showing teeth that looked like yellowed bone. "You chose a cook to be your bodyguard, Silas? You've grown soft in your old age. The kingdom belongs to those who are willing to starve for it." He shifted the remote, his thumb hovering over the button. "Let the girls go," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "You want the territory, you want the docks, you want the unions? Take them. But the families are off limits." The Vulture laughed, a jagged sound that echoed off the concrete pillars. The families are the only thing that makes men like you predictable. I don't want your unions, Silas. I want your bloodline erased. I want the world to watch the Moretti name die in a fire. Marco looked at the SUV, then at the vulture, and then at the shadow moving in the rafters above the villain's head. It was one of Silas's personal guards, a man named Rico who was supposed to be dead in the kitchen. Rico was trailing a silenced sniper rifle, his eye locked onto the vulture's hand. Marco realized he needed to provide a distraction, a reason for the vulture to look away for a single second. Wait. Marco stepped forward, dropping the cleaver. It clanged loudly on the concrete. I have the ledger. The real one. Silas doesn't know, but I found the secondary accounts in the wine cellar. The vulture's eyes flickered to Marco, greed momentarily overriding his malice. The Zurich codes? Marco nodded, taking another step. I'll give them to you. Just let my sister go. She's all I have left. In that heartbeat of hesitation, a single thwip sounded from the rafters. The vulture's hand exploded in a spray of red as the bullet shattered the remote. Silas didn't wait. He lunged forward, his Glock barking 3 times. The vulture tumbled backward, his chest a map of ruin. But as he fell, his other hand reached into his pocket and pulled out a second, smaller device. Too late, he wheezed, his thumb pressing down. A dull, distant tum vibrated through the floor of the garage. It wasn't an explosion here, it was the sound of a dream dying miles away. If this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. Silas fell to his knees, his face turning a ghostly gray. He dropped his gun, his hands reaching for his phone with a frantic, desperate energy. He dialed a number, his knuckles white. The line rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. Silas screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that tore through the garage. He slammed his fists into the concrete until they bled. Marco stood frozen, the weight of the silence from the phone more deafening than the gunfire. His own phone vibrated in his apron pocket. He pulled it out with numb fingers. A text message from an unknown number. The appetizer is served. The main course is next. Below the text was a photo of his sister and Silas's daughter, tied to chairs in a room that looked like a basement, but they were alive. The explosion had been a decoy. Silas. Marco shouted, grabbing the boss by the shoulders and shaking him. Look at the phone. Silas blinked, the tears blurring his vision as he stared at the screen. He grabbed the phone, his breathing hitching. They're alive, they're still alive. He looked at the background of the photo, a specific type of industrial shelving used only in the old canning district near the docks. I know where this is, Silas whispered, the grief instantly hardening back into a lethal, focused resolve. Marco, get in the car. The SUV roared to life, the tires screaming as Silas floored it toward the garage exit. He drove like a man with nothing left to lose, weaving through the midnight traffic of the city. Marco sat in the passenger seat, reloading the Glock magazines with practiced motions he didn't know he possessed. We're going to the canning factory, Silas said, his eyes fixed on the road. It's a maze of steam pipes and cold storage. It's where they take people when they don't want them found. Ever. Why did he blow up the other house? Marco asked, bracing himself as the SUV hopped a curb to bypass a construction zone. Silas gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. To break me. To make me stop looking. To make me think the war was over so he could slip away with the prizes. He turned a sharp corner, the docks coming into view, a skyline of rusted cranes and skeletal warehouses. But he forgot one thing. You don't play with a man's legacy unless you're prepared to see him burn the world down to get it back. They slid to a halt in front of Warehouse 14. The windows were boarded up and a single flickering light illuminated the entrance. Silas handed Marco a tactical vest from the back seat. Put this on. From this point forward, anyone you see who isn't a little girl or your sister is a target. Do you understand? Marco nodded, pulling the vest tight. He felt the weight of the Glock in his hand, a different kind of tool than the knives he had spent his life mastering. I'm ready, Silas. They moved into the warehouse, the air smelling of salt, rot, and old iron. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of a conveyor belt somewhere in the depths of the building. Shadows danced on the walls as they moved past giant vats of industrial brine. Silas signaled for Marco to take the left flank while he took the right. They were approaching the center of the floor, where a small office sat perched above the canning line. A voice crackled over the warehouse intercom. You're late for dinner, Silas? I thought the explosion would have given you indigestion. It was a woman's voice, sharp, melodic, and terrifyingly familiar. Silas stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening. "Elena," he whispered. The office door opened, and a woman stepped out onto the catwalk, a cigarette dangling from her fingers. She was Silas's sister-in-law, the woman who had supposedly died in the car accident 3 years ago. "The vulture was just a puppet, Silas," Elena said, leaning over the railing. "A greedy, stupid man who thought he could lead. I'm the one who wanted the crown. I'm the one who took the girls." She gestured toward the floor below the catwalk. 2 chairs were positioned over a massive industrial grinder used for fish guts. The girls were suspended by a winch, their feet dangling inches from the spinning steel blades. "Elena, stop this," Silas shouted, stepping into the light, his gun aimed at her heart. "Whatever you think I did to your husband, it was the business. He betrayed the family." Elena laughed, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. "Family? You don't know the meaning of the word. You were always the golden child, Silas. While my husband was sent to the front lines to die for your mistakes." She reached for a lever on the wall. "Now, I'm going to watch your mistake grind your future into chum." The winch groaned and the chairs lowered 6 inches. The girls screamed, the sound muffled by the thick duct tape over their mouths. Marco looked at the control box on the far wall, then at Silas. There was no clear shot at Elena without risking a stray bullet hitting the pressurized steam lines that ran directly behind her. If you believe the quiet cook was the real hero all along, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story matters. "Silas, distract her," Marco hissed into his radio. He began to climb the rusted ladder of a nearby brine vat, his hands slick with cold sweat. He needed to reach the overhead catwalk to get to the winch controls. Silas stepped further into the open, holstering his gun, a gesture of false surrender. "Elena, wait. I have the Zurich codes. They're in my pocket. Take them, take the business, just let them go." Elena paused, her hand frozen on the lever. "You're lying." Marco said he had them. Silas shook his head. "Marco is a cook. He found a ledger, but he doesn't have the biometric key. Only I do." He pulled a small silver thumb drive from his pocket and held it up. Elena's eyes lit up with a feverish greed. "Bring it here, Silas. Walk up the stairs slowly. If your hand even twitches toward your belt, I pull the lever." As Silas began the slow climb up the metal stairs, Marco reached the top of the vat. He was 10 feet from the winch motor. He could see the girls below, their eyes wide with terror. He pulled a small paring knife from his sleeve, the one tool he had managed to keep. He didn't need a gun, he needed a surgeon's precision. He lunged across the gap, grabbing a hanging chain and swung toward the motor housing. He landed on the small platform with a thud. Elena heard the noise and turned, her face twisting in rage. "You!" she screamed, pulling a small revolver from her waistband. She fired twice, the bullet sparking off the motor. Marco dove behind the housing, the paring knife gripped between his teeth. He reached into the wiring of the winch, his fingers searching for the main power line. "Silas now!" Marco yelled. Silas didn't hesitate. He pulled the Glock and fired a single shot, not at Elena but at the steam pipe behind her. A jet of superheated vapor erupted, engulfing the catwalk in a white cloud. Elena screamed as the steam scalded her skin, her shots going wild. Marco found the wire and sliced it through. The motor died with a spark, the winch locking in place just as the chairs touched the safety rim of the grinder. Marco didn't wait for the steam to clear. He leaped from the platform onto the chairs, using his weight to swing them away from the blades. He landed hard on the concrete, his legs absorbing the impact, and immediately began tearing the tape from his sister's mouth. "I've got you," he sobbed, pulling her into his arms. "I've got you." Above them, the steam began to dissipate. Silas reached the catwalk, his face a mask of cold iron. Elena lay huddled on the floor, her skin blistering, her eyes filled with a defeated, jagged hate. Silas stood over her, the barrel of his Glock inches from her forehead. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The silence in the warehouse was absolute, broken only by the sobbing of the 2 girls on the floor below. "Silas, don't," Marco called out, his voice echoing through the gloom. Silas looked down at the cook, then back at the woman who had tried to destroy everything. He slowly lowered the gun. "She doesn't deserve the mercy of a bullet," Silas said, his voice flat. He turned to his radio. "Rico, get the cleanup crew in here. And call the police. We're going to let the law handle what's left of the family." Silas walked down the stairs, his movements heavy and slow. He reached his daughter and pulled her into a silent, crushing embrace. He looked at Marco, who was still holding his sister on the floor. The cook looked up, his white apron now a ruin of blood, grease and soot. "The kitchen is going to need a lot of work, Silas," Marco said, a small, weary smile touching his lips. Silas reached out a hand and pulled Marco to his feet. He looked at the chef not as a servant, but as a man who had walked through the fire and come out forged in steel. "Forget the kitchen, Marco," Silas said, draping a heavy arm over the cook's shoulder. "I think it's time we both found a different way to make a living. Somewhere where the only thing we have to create is a life that isn't lived in the shadows." They walked out of the warehouse together, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The cranes and skeletons of the docks looked different in the morning light, no longer like monsters but like the ruins of a past that was finally being left behind. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who risked everything for the truth. The drive back to the city was quiet. The girls fell asleep in the back seat, their heads resting on each other's shoulders. Silas drove with one hand, the other resting on the console, his thumb tracing the scarred knuckles of his right hand. He looked at the rearview mirror, watching the silhouette of the canning district fade away. "What will you do first, Marco?" Silas asked. Marco looked out the window at the waking city. "I think I'll make a bowl of pasta. For my sister. Just plain pomodoro. No secrets, no poison. Just salt, oil, and thyme." Silas nodded. "Save a seat for me. I think I've finally developed a taste for something simple." As the SUV crossed the bridge into the heart of the city, the neon signs flickered off, replaced by the honest, clear light of a new day. The debts were paid, the vultures were gone, and for the first time in his life, the cook didn't feel like he was hiding. He was home. The sun had barely begun to burn through the morning haze over the Hudson when the first crack appeared in their newfound peace. Marco stood in the center of Silas's private penthouse kitchen, the smell of simmering San Marzano tomatoes filling the air. It was supposed to be the simplest meal of his life, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time the refrigerator's compressor kicked on, he saw the flash of the vulture's remote. Every time he picked up his chef's knife, he felt the weight of the meat cleaver sinking into bone. Silas sat at the marble island, his tailored jacket draped over a chair, revealing the heavy white bandage stark against the dark ink on his shoulder. He wasn't looking at the stock market or the news, he was staring at a small hand-drawn picture his daughter had made an hour ago, a picture of a house with a fence and no shadows. The girls were in the media room, the sound of cartoons a surreal backdrop to the tension that hung in the air like unspent lightning. "It's not over, Silas," Marco said, his voice dropping an octave as he stirred the sauce with a wooden spoon. "Elena is in custody and the vulture is in the ground, but the money, the Zurich codes, they're still out there. People don't just forget about $300 million because the boss wants to retire." Silas looked up, his eyes weary, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. "I've already initiated the transfer, Marco. Half to the victims' funds, half into a blind trust for the girls. By tonight, the Moretti accounts will be a zero balance." A soft chime echoed through the penthouse, the secure elevator. Silas was on his feet before the sound faded, his hand hovering over the Glock resting on the counter. Marco gripped the handle of the heavy copper pot, his knuckles white. The doors slid open to reveal Rico, Silas's most trusted lieutenant, his face pale and his breathing ragged. He wasn't carrying a weapon, he was carrying a manila envelope. "Boss," Rico panted, leaning against the doorframe. "The transport from the warehouse. Elena's van. It never made it to the precinct." Silas's jaw tightened until the muscles spasmed. "What happened?" Rico stepped forward, laying the envelope on the marble. Inside were photos taken from a traffic camera 3 miles from the docks. The police van was a blackened skeleton of steel, surrounded by the debris of a high-grade thermite explosion. "No survivors," Rico whispered. "But the coroner's report is missing a body. Elena wasn't in the wreckage when it burned." Marco felt the temperature in the kitchen drop 20 degrees. Elena hadn't just escaped, she had been extracted. If you believe that some fires can never be put out until they consume everything, hit the like button so this story reaches those who understand the weight of a blood feud. "She's coming for the girls," Marco said, his voice a flat, dead thing. "She doesn't care about the money anymore. She wants the legacy dead." Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and the gun. "Rico, get the backup team. We're moving to the sub-level 4 bunker. Now." But as Marco reached for his sister in the other room, the lights in the penthouse flickered, buzzed, and died. In the sudden, absolute darkness, the only sound was the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the kitchen's gas stove igniters, trying and failing to spark. Then a voice came through the penthouse's integrated speaker system. A voice that sounded like it was being filtered through a ventilator. "The pomodoro smells delicious, Marco. It's a shame no one will live long enough to taste it." It wasn't Elena. It was a man's voice, deeper and more mechanical. Silas pulled Marco and the girls into the kitchen's walk-in pantry, shoving them behind the reinforced steel door. "Stay here," Silas commanded, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "Rico, take the service stairs. I'll flush them toward the terrace." Marco grabbed Silas's forearm, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric. "Silas, don't. It's a trap. They wanted us in the penthouse." Suddenly, the smell of tomatoes was replaced by something sharp and chemical: gas. It was flooding through the ventilation shafts. Marco grabbed a wet kitchen towel and pressed it to his sister's face. "The vents," he choked out. Silas fired 2 shots into the ceiling, trying to rupture the pipes, but the gas was too thick. They were being flushed out like rats. If you think a man's past is a debt that can never be fully settled, drop a like so the algorithm knows this story matters. Marco kicked open the pantry door, his eyes stinging. He couldn't see Silas in the haze, but he heard the heavy thud of a struggle in the living room. He crawled along the floor, keeping his sister behind him, his hands searching for the heavy chef's knife he'd left on the island. His fingers closed around the handle just as a pair of combat boots appeared in his line of sight. "Looking for this?" a man sneered, kicking Marco in the ribs. The force of the blow sent him sprawling across the tile. A figure in a gas mask loomed over him, raising a silenced submachine gun. Before the trigger could be pulled, a flash of silver streaked through the smoke. A heavy ceramic plate, thrown with the precision of a frisbee, caught the attacker in the throat. Silas emerged from the fog, his movements a blur of desperate violence. He disarmed the man and drove a knee into his chest, but 2 more shadows were moving in from the balcony. "The roof!" Silas roared, grabbing Marco and the girls. "The helicopter is our only way out." They scrambled through the smoke, bursting through the glass doors onto the terrace. The wind whipped at their clothes, the city lights below looking like a distant, unreachable galaxy. A black helicopter sat idling on the helipad, its rotors creating a deafening roar. But as they reached the edge of the pad, the cabin door slid open. Standing there, silhouetted against the spotlights, was Elena. Her face was a patchwork of bandages and burns, her eyes gleaming with a manic, crystalline light. She wasn't holding a gun, she was holding a detonator. And it wasn't wired to the penthouse. It was wired to the helicopter's fuel tank. "One more step, Silas," Elena screamed over the roar of the blades. "And we all go to heaven together." Silas stopped, his gun leveled at her head, his finger trembling on the trigger. He looked at his daughter, then at Marco, then at the woman who had once been his family. The wind howled around them, a bridge of glass between life and the abyss. The rotor blades beat the air into a frenzy, the downdraft spraying the blood on Silas's bandage into a fine mist. Elena stood in the helicopter's open bay, her thumb white-knuckled over the detonator. She looked like a ghost stitched together with spite, her scorched skin glistening under the helipad's floodlights. Silas lowered his gun just an inch, his eyes darting to the fuel intake valve beneath her feet. He knew the math. If she pressed that button, the penthouse roof would become a pyre. "You won't do it, Elena," Silas shouted, his voice barely cutting through the mechanical scream of the engine. "You're too selfish to die for a grudge." Elena's laugh was lost to the wind, but her eyes said everything. She had nothing left, no husband, no beauty, no syndicate. She was a hollowed-out shell, and hollow things burn the fastest. Marco crouched behind a decorative stone planter, his sister's face pressed into his chest. He looked at the utility hatch 3 feet to his left. It was the main gas shutoff and purge valve for the penthouse's high-pressure kitchen lines. If he could trigger a back-pressure surge, the stovetops inside would erupt, creating a vertical pillar of flame through the ventilation shafts. It would be a distraction, or a death sentence. "Silas," Marco hissed, catching the boss's eye. He pointed to the hatch, then to the ventilation housing sitting directly beneath the helicopter's tail rotor. Silas understood instantly. He needed to keep Elena's eyes on him while the cook performed a miracle with a wrench. Silas took a step forward, spreading his arms wide, the Glock dangling from his finger by the trigger guard. "Look at me, Elena. The girls aren't the legacy. You want the Moretti name gone? Take me. Let the cook take them and walk away." Elena's gaze flickered to the girls, her thumb twitching. "You think you can negotiate with the devil you created?" she shrieked. While she focused on Silas, Marco lunged for the hatch. He ripped the metal cover off, the hinges screaming. Inside was a maze of brass pipes and a heavy red lever. It was locked with a master padbolt. Marco didn't have a key. He had a chef's knife. He slammed the butt of the knife against the lock, the vibration rattling his teeth. Inside the penthouse, the gas sensors began to wail, a high-pitched strobe light flashing through the smoke-filled windows below them. Elena looked down, her focus breaking for a fraction of a second. Crack. The lock snapped. Marco grabbed the red lever and yanked it 180 degrees. A deep, subterranean groan vibrated through the roof. The purge was active. A split second later, the penthouse windows below them shattered as the gas ignited. A massive plume of orange flame shot out of the ventilation housing, rising 30 feet into the air like a dragon's breath. The heat was instantaneous, blistering the paint on the helicopter's tail. The pilot, blinded by the flash and panicked by the sudden shift in air density, jerked the controls. The helicopter lurched violently. Elena lost her footing. She tumbled toward the edge of the bay, the detonator slipping from her hand. Silas moved like a predator unleashed. He didn't go for the gun. He went for the girls, shielding them with his body as the detonator hit the concrete. It didn't explode. The fall had cracked the battery housing. If you think a man who has spent his life in the dark deserves to see his children walk into the light, hit the like button so the world knows justice has a flavor. Silas grabbed Elena's wrist just as she was about to slide off the edge of the roof. She hung there, suspended over the 50-story drop, the wind whistling through the gap between them. Her bandages fluttered in the gale, revealing the raw, red truth of her choices. "Drop me, Silas," she spat, her voice a jagged rasp. "Finish it." Silas looked at her for a long time. He looked at his scarred hands, then back at Marco, who was standing over the purge valve, his face covered in soot. The chef nodded, a silent recognition of the man Silas was trying to become. Silas didn't let go. He hauled her back onto the concrete with a grunt of exertion, pinning her down as Rico and the backup team burst onto the roof. "Take her," Silas commanded, his voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and relief. "And this time, use a cage that doesn't burn." He turned away from the chaos, walking toward Marco. The cook stood there, the chef's knife still gripped in his hand, his white apron now a tattered rag of black ash. "The sauce is ruined," Marco whispered, his adrenaline fading into a heavy, bone-deep fatigue. Silas reached out and put a hand on Marco's shoulder, his grip firm. "The sauce can be remade, Marco. The lives can't." He looked at the girls who were being wrapped in blankets by the medics. The sun was fully up now, the light reflecting off the glass towers of the city like 1,000 diamonds. If this story proved that even a cook can change the course of a war, subscribe so I can tell you what happened when the girls finally sat down at the table. 6 months later, a small bistro opened on the coast of Sicily. There were no armed guards, no black sedans, and no silver briefcases. The menu was simple: 1 pasta, 1 fish, 1 wine. The head chef was a man with steady hands and a calm smile. In the corner booth, an older man with a faded scar on his shoulder sat with 2 young girls, teaching them how to twirl spaghetti without a spoon. The door to the bistro opened, and a cool breeze carrying the scent of salt and lemon drifted in. Marco looked up from the stove, his eyes meeting Silas's. There was no fear, no secrets, just the steam from the pot and the quiet clink of silverware. The debt was paid. The kingdom was gone. And for the first time the food was just food.